Do you know this guy, Tintin, as he is known in English, or Tintin, as we would know him in France or Belgium? If you're Steven Spielberg, yes, you know him. He's one of your heroes. You made a movie about him. If you're myself, of course I know him. I grew up reading The Adventures of Tintin. He was my hero when I was 7. But if you're Belgian, or if you're Congolese, he might have a different connotation to him, because Tintin is not just a childhood hero. Maybe he's a racist. Maybe he is a symbol of one of the worst cases of European colonization in the history of the world. Stay tuned as we explore the story of the Belgian colonization of the Congo. In the previous videos, we have explored different cases of European colonization in the 19th century. We studied the case of the British in India, or the French in Algeria. The Congo is another notorious case. The Congo had a long history of interaction with Europeans, going all the way back to the earliest Portuguese exploration of the coast of Africa. Sometime in the 15th century, one of these early Portuguese explorers that were kind of reconnoitering the coast of Africa got to a spot that was kind of weird in the Atlantic Ocean, where instead of the blue-gray seas of the Atlantic Ocean, he encountered some more brownish waters. When they dropped a bucket into the water and tasted that water, it was sweet, not salty. That explorer, Diego Cao, C-A-O, discovered that what he was in was not seawater, but actually water from a river that was so huge coming out of the coast of Africa that its waters could be seen way, way out in the ocean. This was the mouth of the Congo River. As the Portuguese went a bit further into the Congo in the late 14 or early 1500s, they discovered that there was a powerful local kingdom there called the Congo. It's usually spelled with a K in order to distinguish it from the modern-day country of the Congo, spelled with a C. And the Congo is a bit confusing because you also have a river called the Congo, and today you have two countries called the Congo, the former French colonial Congo and the former Belgian Congo. We're talking about the big one, the former Belgian Congo today. So getting back to the medieval kingdom of the Congo, with a K, this was quite an impressive kingdom in pre-modern Africa. Beautiful capital, provinces, governors, a king that was quite well known in Europe because he converted to Catholicism, learned how to read and write, and exchanged a fascinating series of letters with the King of Portugal. It's also a tragic story, though, because he wanted to learn about Christianity and get priests to come. Instead, what he got was slave traders. And as the slave trade developed, more and more people in the Congo were victimized by it. And that led to a series of wars locally, as local slave traders wanted to capture PWs to export them across the Atlantic. And eventually, that would lead to the downfall of the Congo kingdom. By the early 1800s, where our story truly begins, the Congo was no longer the magnificent, powerful kingdom that it was once. Instead, it was divided between 300 small principalities that were warring against each other. The coastline had been largely depopulated, and in practice, the area was ripe for the taking. European knowledge of the Congo, however, was quite limited in the 19th century. Of course, people knew about the coast of Africa. The Portuguese under Vasco da Gama had been going around Africa since the late 1400s. Europeans knew the northern part of Africa pretty well. The French had colonized Algeria, for example. They kind of knew the end of the Nile River because he had long encounters with Egypt in the ancient times. But as you got deeper into Africa, this was very much terra incognita. Those maps are blank. And that became one of the big projects of the 19th century in terms of geography, to fill in the blanks. What is there? Who lives there? What language does it speak? Where are the rivers? Where are the mountains? Just fill in the blanks. One of the key mysteries in particular was, where does the Nile River come from? We know where it ends in the Mediterranean, but where does that very long river, the longest in the world, have the original springs? So quite a lot of effort was put in the 19th century. Plenty of explorers left, especially from Great Britain. And their story usually is that they got to Africa, caught a tropical fever, and died. End of the story. Africa in the 19th century was nicknamed the white man's graveyard. You had plenty of tropical fevers, which were deadly to Europeans, which also explained why it had not been colonized or explored much up until that point. Europeans usually stuck to the coast, buying slaves initially, but they didn't hang around too much because otherwise a tsetse fly or maybe an Anopheles mosquito might get to them. Some of these explorers did survive. The most famous of them was David Livingstone. Today we're going to cover a lot of larger-than-life personalities. Some of them are heroes and quite a few villains, I'm afraid. He is one of the more heroic figures. He was a very idealistic figure, a devout Christian. His hope was to go as a missionary to Africa and to convert people to what he considered to be the true faith. Typically, he was not too successful in those endeavors. You have to imagine a single person in a big continent trying to spread the gospel. It was a hopeless task. He was also an idealist who was against the slave trade because by the late 19th century, Europeans that used to come to Africa to buy slaves had now done a complete 180 on the topic and had abandoned slavery in their New World colonies and had stopped doing the slave trade across the Atlantic. And with the zeal of new converts, they were now trying to eradicate slavery within Africa itself where it still existed. And Livingstone hoped to stop slavery by exploring Africa and shedding the light of civilization. He was not too successful on that either, had a kind of a hard time going against entrenched interests. His third passion would have been the pursuit of knowledge, scientific knowledge, geographic knowledge, and there was far more successful, doing a lot of reconnoitering of areas in Africa that were not known to Europeans. He had a strange family life because he was married and had kids. Initially, he wanted to do his exploration with family and kids in tow. Quickly realized that was pretty dangerous for his family and also pretty impractical, so he ended up leaving them in England mostly. I always wonder how that works, that in the morning daddy goes off to work and you say goodbye to daddy, and then you can't see daddy for the next 3 years, and you don't even know if he's alive until one day he shows up, back up, goes and gives a big speech at the Royal Geographic Society in London, and a big hug to his family, and maybe another big hug to his wife, and then another kid comes along and he leaves. But among those voyages I did in Africa, I discovered quite a few things. Explored the course of the Zambezi River, which is a major river in the southern portion of Africa. Discovered for Europeans, that is. Big falls that are a major tourist attraction there today. And for the record, the idiot that you see on the photo, it's not me. Those falls are known today as Victoria Falls, after the Queen of England. And there are quite a few places in Africa that are named Victoria this and Victoria that, because British explorers first got to that area in the 19th century. There's a big lake called Victoria, for example. The other thing that Livingstone and others explored would be a bit further north into the area where the Nile River came from, the Great Lakes region of East Africa. And what they discovered is that the sources of the Nile are a bit complicated. You have two major tributaries to the Nile, the Blue Nile, the White Nile, and they come, one of them more from Ethiopia and the other more from the Great Lake region of Central Africa. And you have one lake that goes into the other, it's very swampy. So they were eventually able to chart down where all these rivers came from and solve the mystery of the origins of the Nile, as well as the mystery of the flood of the Nile, as it turned out in the tropical region of Central Africa. You have a rainy season and you have a dry season. So when it rains a lot, well, all that water makes its way down all the way to the Nile River and it floods. And the last voyage, Livingstone was not heard of for many, many years, more than was usual. Some people wondered in Europe whatever happened to him. Is he dead? Is he alive? Where is he? Has he found something great? People did not know too much. And let's shift to another great explorer of Central Africa, great as in influential, not great as a great man. Henry Morton Stanley was his name, and he was a horrible individual. Lied about a lot of things, including his own name. Henry Morton Stanley was not his birth name. He also lied about his country. He claimed to be American. He was not. He actually was from Wales in Britain, and his father was a local nobleman. His mother was a maid, and you know where this is going. The father knocked up the maid and then would have nothing to do with the child, and the poor mother had to abandon the child, and poor Henry Morton Stanley grew up in an orphanage in Wales. Think of it as like a life a la Dickens. First chance that Henry Morton Stanley got, fled from Wales, had a life of adventure, and eventually found his way right here in Louisiana, in New Orleans. We eventually had developed a relationship with a local merchant and eventually adopted his name, and that's why he changed from his early name to Henry Morton Stanley and adopted a whole new identity and claimed that he had been an American all his life. Many of these explorers, adventurers that you see in Africa in the 19th century have a bit of a chip on their shoulder or gigantic egos. In his case, he had a lot to prove coming from such low extraction in Europe. Stanley had enough things in his lifetime to fill multiple lifetimes. When he lived in Louisiana, the Civil War broke out. He fought on the southern side, was captured. Life in the POW camp in the Civil War was not the nicest, so he offered to switch camps to fight in the northern side to escape from the POW camp. And so was one of those few people that were veterans of the Civil War on both sides. He ended on the northern side, meaning that he won the Civil War. After the war, one of his careers was to become a journalist, which was an exciting period to be a journalist because there was so much going on. The rotary press had been invented, so now newspapers were cheap. They had huge circulation. New York City had multiple newspapers with a circulation of over 1 million apiece. He worked for one of them. And the standards of journalistic practice had not been established yet, so you could publish whatever you wanted. As long as it sold, your editor was happy. Perfect for a person like Stanley who liked to twist the truth a little bit. So Henry Morton Stanley, as a journalist, covered some of the last wars in the American West against the Indians. And then one day his editor in New York told him, I have a great story for you. You know David Livingstone, that British explorer, very famous? Well, he's kind of got lost in Africa and we don't know where he is. Why don't you go there and find him? That would make for a great story. Think of the assignment. You go to Africa and an entire continent, you're supposed to find one man, needle in a haystack. Kudos to Stanley. He actually went to Africa and found Livingstone, who was still alive, happened to be recovering from illness on the side of one of the great lakes in the Central African region. So that's where you have that famous encounter where Stanley walked up to him and said, Dr. Livingstone, I presume? Best thing about the whole story, Livingstone stayed in Africa and died shortly thereafter. So Stanley was the only survivor of the encounter, so he could make himself look a bit prettier. Stanley later returned to Africa, this time more as an explorer. What he did was to go from the eastern side of Africa all the way to the west. The hope was to reconnoiter the area of the Congo River. Obviously, the mouth of the Congo River had been known since the days of Diego Cao, but the inland part was not known to Europeans because there are some rapids not far from the mouth of the river. So going upriver was impossible by boat. So Stanley put a whole expedition together, and you have to imagine a huge expedition because beasts of burden don't do too well in Central Africa. They get parasites and so forth. So most things would have been carried on the back of human beings, African porters. They did manage to cross from East Africa, eventually bumped into a river, which turned out to be a tributary of the Congo River. So they kind of floated down the Congo River, making some important discoveries as to where the river was and how to put it on a map. So a great explorer in that sense, not the nicest person. Stanley, as he would go down the river, couldn't help but be bored out of his mind because it's been 2 weeks on the river and they're just floating down lazily and it's hot and there are mosquitoes and one of his friends just died again. So what he would do is get his gun and start shooting at things on the riverbanks. Here's a giraffe. Here's an elephant. Here's a village of people. He would actually shoot people as game, which gives you a sense of the way that people in Europe or North America would look at people of African birth in the 19th century as being some kind of intermediate stage between humans and other great apes. And that gives you a sense of the strength of the racism that was part of the colonial experiment in Africa in the late 19th century. But Stanley did make it all the way to the rapids and then walked all the way to the coast. And best of all, he was the only European survivor of that expedition. So he all again got to write the story. So as all these reports came in from Livingstone and Stanley and other explorers about the central part of Africa, the map was filled in, and the reports indicated, one, there's a lot of riches over there. Ivory tusks, rubber, copper, coal, you name it. The Congo is a geological masterpiece. And at the same time, those areas were not very strong technologically, militarily, politically. just at a time when European science had improved enough that became easier to survive in the African climate because of improvements in modern medicine and the knowledge of tropical pathologies. So that launched what became known as the Scramble for Africa, as all the major European powers wanted a chunk of the action. Things got pretty heated, and there are times in the late 19th, early 20th century where France and Britain almost got to a war over the case of the Sudan. Who gets to have it? It's the Fashoda crisis. And then later on, France and Germany almost went to a war over Morocco in the early 1900s. So in order to cool things down a bit, one of the European leaders, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany, summoned a big assembly called that the Congress of Berlin, which was hosted in Berlin, 1884 to 1885. And it's very cliche, but you have to imagine all these older gentlemen from Europe gathered up around a map on a table and kind of with a ruler and a pencil deciding, well, you get this, I get that, splitting Africa. How many delegates do you have from Africa at that conference? 0. This is a heyday of European imperialism. The white man knows best. That Congress of Berlin is relevant because it's the one that helped split a number of these colonies and resolve a number of colonial claims in Central Africa. Also, many of the borders inherited from that Congress or other colonial disputes ended up becoming the borders of colonies, and those colonies, the borders of modern-day independent countries in Africa that are still valid today. They come from the Congress of Berlin in that late 19th century colonial era, with some relevant long-term consequences, because many places in Africa tend to be prone to ethnic conflict, and one of the reasons that has been put forward for those ethnic conflicts is that the borders suck. That some lines were drawn with a ruler in Berlin, and then they split one ethnic group in two, or in the same colony they put two ethnic groups with a long history of rivalries. You don't really have a nation state, so borders that correspond to natural borders like a river or mountain range. And that's part of the problem in Africa post-independence today. Getting back to the issue of the Congo, quite a few countries like France, like Britain, wanted to have access to the Congo. That was the big prize at the Congress of Berlin. Another person that wanted to have the Congo was Leopold II, another larger-than-life creature, also a terrible figure. Leopold II was king of Belgium. And as a French person, I don't want to make fun of Belgian people. We have a bad habit of doing that. But we did beat them at the World Cup in 2016, so take that.
Griezmann with the corner, kicking him, Tintin, arriving on the near post.
Well, anyway, the King of Belgium looked down upon his own country. Little country, little people is how he referred to Belgium. Because he was a person who dreamed of being Alexander the Great, or Julius Caesar, or Genghis Khan, and he was just the King of Belgium. A small country, a small triangle wedged in the heart of Europe. And sure, the country was rich. It went through the Industrial Revolution and was one of the richest countries in the world per capita at the time, plenty of iron and coal and industry. But it's a small country, and you can't create a world empire using Belgium as the base. You're not the Tsar of Russia or the King of Britain. So a man with a gigantic ego and also a lot of personal faults. He happened to be a pedophile, let's put it this way. He was involved with a very young Parisian prostitute. There's a lot of things that are wrong about his life. Let's just stick with the colonial aspect for now. So what did Leopold II do? He wanted to get the Congo. But as just the King of Belgium, it was difficult to convince much greater powers like France and Britain to yield that prize to him. So cleverly, he decided to make it all about humanitarianism. He had read from the reports of Stanley that slavery still existed in Central Africa. He was shocked, beyond shocked, to see that. And so he promised to the people at Berlin that if he, or more specifically a private non-profit company, was given a grant over the Congo, then he would dedicate his fortune and his life work to turning that area into a free trade area where all the nations would come in and trade, and most importantly, fight against the scourge of slavery. This would be one of the great works of the time. And sounded so idealistic, such a civilizing mission, that the French, the British, and other would-be colonizers could not have any better things to say, because they only wanted money out of the Congo. And that's how Belgium, one of the smaller countries in Europe, got the big chunk, the big prize in Central Africa, the Congo. When I say Belgium, I should say the king of Belgium, because the Congo Free State, the colony was a name, was handed over to a specific company created by the king of Belgium, who would have like two jobs. King of Belgium on one side, and separately would be head of the Congo Free State. And it should have been ringing a few bells that the Congo Free State, when it was registered as a private for-profit company, not as an NGO, not as a humanitarian venture, to give a sense of what he was truly after. Well, Leopold II never went to the Congo, and instead to actually conquer the Congo, he wanted to hire somebody that was as ruthless as he was, and that was an expert in the Congo. And you know who that is, Henry Morton Stanley, who was hired as a mercenary to conquer the Congo on behalf of Leopold II. Stanley amazingly managed to conquer the Congo, even though he was acting on behalf of a private company from Belgium, the Congo Free State. So he only had a handful of mercenaries with him. How did he do that? Well, in the same way that the East India Company, a private company from Britain, was able to take control of a much larger country, India, largely by using local mercenaries. In India, the EIC hired sepoys. In the Congo, Stanley employed what it was called the force publique. And because the country was so atomized, so split into various rival ethnic groups, he was able to hire one against the other and essentially conquer the Congo by relying on Congolese troops, the force publique, black troops with just a handful of white officer mercenaries. He also used a number of tricks. He would go to a chief and ask them to sign a treaty to surrender all their mineral rights to their land. Of course, the treaty was written in French legalese, so people would sign off things that they didn't understand. Or he would claim to have supernatural powers. He might shake somebody's hand, and sure enough, there was a spark of electricity as if he commanded lightning. In fact, there was an electrical wire going down his sleeve and into a car battery. We claim to make fire appear at will. In fact, he just used a magnifier and concentrated all the hot rays of the equatorial sun on some dry kindling. So whatever he used, either violence or trickery, he was able to make good on the claim of the Congo Free State. And the rule of Leopold II would go all the way from the Congress of Berlin, 1885, to 1908. So what about the record of Leopold II in the Congo, or more specifically Stanley? Where there's some construction that goes on, as Stanley went up the Congo River, and where the river would become navigable after those rapids, he set up what became the capital of the Congo. When naming it, he had to figure out, who do I want to name it after? Oh, my boss. Let's suck up to the boss, always. And so that town became Leopoldville. Today on the modern-day map, you'll see it as Kinshasa, the present-day capital of the independent Congo. And as he went all the way to the other side of the country, on the eastern Congo, he set up another big town. In this case, he named it after the other favorite person in the world, himself, and that became Stanleyville. Today on the modern-day map, it would show up at Kisangani. The purpose of that Congo Free State was to be open to all nations. It wasn't. And to combat slavery. It did not. One big demand for labor was just to transport things. Eventually, a railroad was set up from the coastline to Leopoldville, but initially there was none. So to carry things, everything had been to be carried on a human back. And I mean everything. If you have a steamship that will be on the Congo River, it has to be built in Belgium, brought to the coast of Congo, and then in crates, on human back, carried all the way into the interior. Some of these expeditions would have death rates of 50% of the porters. Thousands of those porters would be needed. There was also a need for people to go and get ivory and then bring it back again on somebody's back to the coastline. That also requires much work. And then rubber became the big export for the Congo. Nowadays, a lot of the rubber we have is more synthetic rubber, not so in the late 19th century where it's all natural rubber. And at a time when automobiles are starting to appear, bicycles, and there's a big demand for rubber. So how do you get rubber? Well, from trees, the rubber tree or the rubber vine in the tropical regions. So that became a big task for the Congolese to go and harvest rubber for the benefits of Leopold II. Not a pleasant task to do. That involves trekking into the jungle for weeks. Then you cut the bark of one of these rubber trees, and there's some gooey liquid that comes out, sap, a bit like maple syrup from a maple tree. And because it's so liquidy, you usually would smear it over your body to have more contact area, surface area for things to evaporate. And as the rubber would harden, it would just pull it up from your body, a bit like a wax to get your hair out, and then make a ball, and then just repeat the process all day long until you had harvested enough rubber to make your quota. Not a pleasant task. So most Congolese didn't want to do that to enrich a king that they had never met and would never meet. So much violence was employed to find those porters and people to find ivory and rubber. How do you get those workers? Well, maybe you resort to outright slavery. And slavery exists in the Congo. You had a notorious slave trader in the eastern part of the Congo, for example, Tipo Tip, with a habit of capturing slaves and bringing them to the east coast of Africa, onto Zanzibar, and then eventually the Middle East. Well, Stanley bought some slaves from him, the very man that he should have driven out of business if they had been serious about the humanitarian venture he bought slaves from. Or some other people in the Congo might simply be captured by the force publique, forced to work under threat of violence. The chicotte was a whip made with hippopotamus hide. That was a way to whip people into submission. Or hostage taking was a frequent method. People in a village would be taken hostage, at least the women and children, and then the men would be sent into the jungle with a clear word: come back 1 month from now with so many 100 pounds of rubber, otherwise we will do terrible things to your wife and children. And they did. Death or mutilation was frequent. Altogether, it's estimated that when the Congo was taken over by the Congo Free State in 1885, the population of that area was in the neighborhood of 20 million. By the time the colony was taken away from Leopold II in 1908, the population had dropped to roughly 10 million, half of that. The missing would be victims of starvation, victims of outright violence, or victims of the lower birth rate caused by all that population movement during the period. The 10 million people missing, to give you a point of comparison, the Holocaust killed about 6 million Jews. So that would rank as one of the great catastrophes of human time, even though it's often forgotten today. Forgotten or not even known back when it was going on, because the image that people had in Belgium was that Leopold II was doing great work in the Congo. They didn't know better. All the information came from agents of the Congo Free State. So he was Mother Teresa as far as everybody else was concerned for many, many years. Until finally the truth started to come out of the Congo bit by bit. One such person that helped reveal the truth was Joseph Conrad, again, not his real name. He had a much longer, complicated Polish name because he came from Poland. He lived in France for a while and became fluent in France, had a million different adventures, including living in the Congo during the part of the Congo Free State. And later became a writer in England, and that's what he's known for today, as a novelist in English language, which remarkably was his third language. I know the French person I write in English, which is hard enough. In his case, he wrote in his third adopted language. The most famous novel by him is one called Heart of Darkness, which is based on his own experiences in the Congo as an agent of the Congo Free State, where he spent about 6 months. And the novel follows, well, just what Conrad had experienced of arriving at the river, going upriver, witnesses some of the atrocities that would go on, and eventually arriving at a compound where some madman of the Congo Free State would live, terrorizing the natives and surrounded by a palisade with the heads of his enemies on top. If you have not read that novel, Heart of Darkness, read it, or maybe you look at the movie adaptation, which is also great. That movie is Apocalypse Now. And the movie buffs, they are wondering, wait a minute, that doesn't take place in the Congo. No, it's set during the Vietnam War, but it's based on the story Heart of Darkness. Francis Ford Coppola took the same story, except now we're going up the Mekong River. And the madman at the end of the journey will be a U.S. Army officer played by Marlon Brando. So when that novel came out, that helped dispel some of the mistaken beliefs about all the good that Leopold II was doing in the Congo. Beyond that, there was another powerful figure called Inman Mohan. He was an accountant, a bean counter. Think of him as kind of a gray figure, not one of these larger-than-life figures. All his job was just to be in Antwerp in the port, just counting what was coming in and out of the ships of the Congo Free State Company. But he was a smart man, and he noticed that when things were shipped to the Congo, it was guns, mostly. And when the ships would come back, then you had rubber, you had ivory, you had all sorts of valuable resources. And you wonder how come that happens. I thought we're supposed to do good there, and we're only shipping guns. How are we paying for all these things? And he had a strong hunch that violence was employed. And through contacts he had within the company, he bit by bit learned the whole truth about what was going on in the Congo. So he quit his job for the Congo Free State Company and became a full-time activist. He had a whole magazine dedicated to publishing the truth about the Congo. He wrote a book called Red Rubber, and he would go on lecture tours in Britain and then show pictures, because that was a big thing that really conveyed the information. Some of these disturbing pictures that you're seeing right now of a man looking at the severed hand of his daughter, because he did not meet the rubber quota, and this is what they did to his child. Kodak is what undermined the reputation of Leopold II. So eventually there was enough public outcry that the colony was taken away from Leopold II in 1908. He was not really punished. He got to keep all his ill-gotten gains. He died shortly thereafter, a rich man. And in fact, his reputation remains remarkably good overall. There are still statues and such of him in Belgium. There's a museum about the history of Africa in Belgium, and curators there have a very hard time figuring what to do, because this was a museum created during the time of Leopold II, all about worshipping the colonization of the Congo and Leopold II, when people know nowadays that the reality was quite different. So what do? Do you tear away the valuable statues from the walls and chip away the head of Leopold II, or do you kind of leave it there as part of the building and then put a little note at the bottom saying, by the way, this guy is basically Adolf Hitler? So now you're asking yourself, what happened in 1908 after the Leopold II was stripped of the colony? Did the Congo become independent? Nope, this was still the heyday of imperialism. Instead, the Congo was handed over to a different colonial master, in that case, Belgium itself. And it was thought that instead of having a private company, now you would have a crown ruling the Congo, and it would be done in a way that was more benevolent, in the same way that India went from the hands of the East India Company all the way to the British Crown in 1858. So what was the record of the Congo under Belgian rule, which would last until independence in 1960? In that case, there are still some bad. Some of the atrocities continued for several years. But generally, the idea is to be more benevolent. Dominer pour servir was the motto of one of the governors of the Congo. To dominate, but in order to serve. So you have a situation where now the Belgians start building cities and roads and railroads and missions and dispensaries and primary schools for everybody, so that everybody in the Congo will now have a first, second, third grade education, some basic literacy. On the other hand, this was done within the confines of the racial environment of the time. And remember that this is still a time when people have human zoos that they go to in Europe to just picture, to look at animals and human beings from exotic places like the Congo. So the structure of the Congo was very much a white governor, white doctors, white engineers, white officers, white school teachers, and then black people at the bottom, stuck at the second or third grade education, no matter what their intellectual merits might be. So what about all that Tintin that I promised you in the intro? Well, here it is. You may have noticed that I changed the illustration behind me. I took away my beloved Haitian painting and replaced that with some of my most beloved Tintin comics, when he goes to Tibet or when he goes to the moon. If you're not too familiar with Belgian comics, they are quite big around the world, not in the US. In the US, Superman or Batman seem to be more popular. But European comics tend to be more about the story, a bit like a manga, say, among Japanese comics. The album in the Congo is one of the earliest ones. And that album has become a bit problematic nowadays because it is very typical of the mindset that underpin the Belgian effort in the Congo. He means well. He goes to the Congo to help out the Congolese. On the other hand, he is definitely smarter than they are, and they should pay his respect to him. He has adventures, he goes around, he shoots animals, he helps the Congolese, he teaches a class to them, except the Congolese are really dumb and they have a hard time adding 2 and 2 together. And on it goes with the white man, that young white man, Tintin, going to save the Congo. all the way to the last frame, the last page of the story, where he gets notified that he's supposed to go to the United States for his next adventure, and the next album is set in Chicago, where he's fighting Al Capone, and off he goes into the sunset. And you see all the Congolese, after Tintin lives, all heartbroken because the white man has left. And to think that all the white men in Europe are the same, they explain in a badly broken French pidgin. So the album today has become controversial. You even have some people that call for it being banned from libraries. And that takes us to larger questions of historical memory. I mentioned how the Museum of African History in Brussels is kind of a shrine to Leopold II. So how do you deal with that? Or how do you deal with an album from Tintin from the 1920s or 30s that is so obviously racist and colonialist? Do you ban all of that and sanitize the past? But would that mean burying your head in the sand and just ignoring the past? Or you just let things stand? Or do you do what I would recommend doing, allow all these artifacts to survive, but then with some explanation, some context to explain people why they are representative of their times? We have faced similar issues about matters of historical memory here in Louisiana, dealing with all the statues of Confederate, quote-unquote, heroes. I'll let you ponder all these issues, have fun in the comment sections, and next time we'll move on to yet another exploration of world history's greatest hits.